Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, very pleased to welcome Dan Stein, who is the president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, hosting this event that we're at. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here at Hold Their Feet to the Fire Radio Row for maybe my 10th year. I'm not really sure. It's been a long time, but I look forward to it every year. Dan, thank you so much.
Rob, always good to see you. Thanks for coming up. Great day. Amazing weather.
And an amazing view. You don't get to see it, although you know what I'm looking at right now. And I'm like, this couldn't be scripted any better. It's absolutely perfect to be here, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Would you tell us, for people who are unfamiliar with FAIR, maybe a brief history about the work that you've done and the work that you do?
Well, I kind of feel like the United States was fortunate in that some folks in the mid-'70s who had a lot of foresight got together and said, you know, worldwide the population is growing very fast, and the percentage of people who are poor and have everything to gain and nothing to lose by trying to get to a country like the United States is going to skyrocket, which, of course, it has. Mm-hmm. We need to have a professional organization to help the average American understand immigration issues, what's needed to control this incredible pressure on our borders, advise Congress, professional policy making, big tent, bipartisan. But because of the nature of the issue, you know, folks need to get some expertise, and FAIR and some allied groups, some of which we've spun off, have been instrumental in helping shape policy over time. Unfortunately, there's also been another side, which is the cheap labor, multinational, export jobs, import foreign labor. And now you have the Democrats have careened over to the far left, where they've been kind of taken over by this radical socialist wing that really sees immigration as changing the demographics in their favor. And you know how it is with these elites. You see this in the classic literature. They basically believe they have the intelligence to govern the society for the rest of us, to bring us to a socialist utopia. And part of the process, Condorcet, William Godwin, all the way through the Frankfurt School, there has to be a transition period in their view. We saw this with the Bolsheviks, right?
Yes.
And during the transition period, they justify whatever they're doing because it's going to lead to this utopian society, which means suppressing alternative ideas, speech, demonizing opponents. So moving away from our kind of British conservative traditions of free speech and debate, reaching consensus of a government that's kind of the groundwork upon which voluntary associations, family, community, church, things like that are built through self-governance. They want this top-down autocratic system of dependency that they also believe will help them achieve one-party political control. And they occasionally are willing to admit that. Now, if you come around and say, well, why are you trying to change the demographics for partisan gain? They claim you're, trafficking in conspiracy theories. But that's obviously that's what they say they're doing. They're simply trying to increase their chances. And Joe Biden, who, got to give him credit, Rob, it's the systematic way in which they have sabotaged U.S. immigration controls. Even when courts will say you need to keep in place this one thing that helps deter illegal immigration, they go, oh, okay, well, then they issue new regulations to undo that as well. They've sabotaged these immigration controls. They clearly intend to do this. They see there's millions of people who are making the plans to come up through that border. They have no plan except accelerating it in the dead of night or flying in people from the home countries without telling anybody. The whatever you want to call the legacy media, don't follow what happens when they come into the country. They disappear. Nobody knows where they went. Communities are never consulted. And this is, it seems to be part of an agenda or a plan, right? Those Haitians coming up from Chile, they're not eligible for asylum under U.S. law because they're resettled in a third country with work documents. They travel through 5 or 6 safe countries to get all the way up here. And under international and U.S. law, we're not obligated to entertain an asylum claim for somebody who behaves in that manner. They're not refugees in the traditional sense of country of first asylum. So this administration still says we're going to let them all in. Maybe they'll show up 60 days later for an ICE notice to appear. Maybe they'll show up for a court hearing date years later. And then meantime, Democrats push mass amnesty on a partisan basis that'll change the whole political alignment of the country. So everybody can kind of see the agenda. Now, I couldn't have had this conversation with you, Rob, like 5 years ago. 5 years ago, Trump had things under control. The agenda that I'm talking about was kind of under wraps. But people like AOC came into Congress and some of her fellow travelers. Biden made some kind of Faustian bargain to get the nomination over Bernie Sanders second time because they didn't want Sanders. But he effectively said, I'll carry the water for the Sanders platform, and he empowered the kind of extreme left wing. It's not the Democratic Party of your grandfather. I mean, Democrats always had strong union labor as a part of the AFL-CIO, and they were strong border controllers. And that's why you can see comments from people like Schumer and Harry Reid and Bill and Hillary Clinton and people like that who now sound like Donald Trump,
Even
back
Barack
in the 90s.
Obama.
Even Barack Obama. So, like, what happened? What the political lobotomy that took place in the Democratic Party during the Obama administration has its genesis in these trade agreements in the early 90s that the Democrats had to abandon the labor market components, which is why, by the way, Trump won in 2016.
We're talking about NAFTA.
And Biden, NAFTA and its other associated trade agreements. But Biden, Biden basically made all the mistakes Hillary made, but because of the coronavirus, never had to actually publicize those positions, okay? He just ran on the coronavirus and blamed Trump for the coronavirus. But he's come in now, and you see the polling. I mean, I think there was an article in Breitbart yesterday that had the polling on approval of his immigration position somewhere between 25 and like 38% on all polling. This isn't, we're not just talking about a Breitbart spot. This is all polling, okay? This is so far underwater politically. I mean, unless the Democrats continue this mail-in balloting and destroy the secret ballot and allow ballot harvesting by basically, that's what that mail-in ballot is. There's no secret ballot with the mail-in balloting. Instead of having mail-in balloting as an exception for just those people absentee, it's now going to become the norm. That, in a way, you'd almost think because they're letting all these people run into the country with no testing, do they just want to extend this pandemic because they want to do what Governor Newsom did yesterday and make it the law in California? I mean, that seems to be the whole. It's all about power, and in the end, this debate used to be characterized by a debate among equals. Okay, talk radio, which everybody said would long be dead, has retained its vibrancy because at a time when people can turn on the TV and hear nothing but obfuscation, lying, misrepresentation. Talk radio, some digital outlets. You come to Feet to the Fire, Rob. You're talking to real folks, people who are impacted. People who are sincere. It's just a sincere event about people who are on the front lines, people whose lives have been changed by losing loved ones to people here illegally, people who have, in one way or another, seen the experience, as well as policy experts who don't take money from China, okay, not in the pockets of the Saudis, but just good old Americans who care about the future of our country. And in the old days, there used to be some patriotic association with corporatist interests in this country, but because of the whole Chinese model, you can see it. They've sold out to China because that's where the money is. And they're willing to basically diss Americans to stay in good graces with the Chinese and, unfortunately, which also means the far left. So when you have this multinational collusion, the high-tech companies colluding now with the Democrats in censorship and control of social media, suddenly things like talk radio, which people might have thought, maybe the new text will replace, have become like this essential voice, the beacon, okay? The beacon of a warning on the hill of where people can get truth and still hear, just like the old days with the shortwave radio, right? Get the real deal.
Dan Stein, I've got to ask you on that front, do you believe there will be an attack on radio, particularly maybe a return of the fairness doctrine or other restrictions being put in? They seem to show no restraint in this administration, and I know they know the power of what we do.
Well, compared to what they would want to do, the fairness doctrine would be in advance because at least they'd be obligated to have two sides of the issue, which is what built the spirit of sort of hearing both sides on a debate we're all about in the limited channel spectrum we had. No, what they're going to try to do is revoke the licenses of organizations that they feel are just simply covert. Suddenly, everything that they don't agree with is white supremacy. And everything that harkens back to the traditions, customs, attributes, the cultural conventions, the ideals of de Tocqueville, of a self-governing society, and even the touchstones of history. Whether you agree or disagree with what the Robert E. Lee statue symbolized, it was part of a national reconciliation that was important to bind the country back together after the Civil War. Why did the South want to celebrate these military heroes? There were reasons that had nothing to do with celebrating the institution of slavery. And there always are lessons in history that Americans can learn. But to the left, the past is trash. It doesn't matter whether it's Robert E. Lee or any slave owner like George Washington or anybody else. Now they're saying the Constitution requires a trigger warning. There's some kind of psychosis that's been imbibed in people. Obviously, I think climate change is still a legitimate issue, but at the same time, if you sell it to young people at a tender age in such a way that it creates psychosis, you're playing with fire. And they seem to have no problem. Now they've taken K through 12, they've taken this critical race theory and teaching second graders this nonsense. They're not interested and concerned about the psychological damage they're doing to Gen Zs or anyone else. So you see there's no limits to which they'll go because, let's face it, the Bolsheviks wiped out all their fellow travelers, their socialist rivals, like 3 or 4 other factions, Mensheviks and others. This is during the transition period, this is what takes place. They believe it's required that these alternative interests and voices be stomped out. They're reactionary because they believe, they rationalize that this utopian idea can be created. But our framers built a constitution built around the idea that man is not perfect. It requires some governance, but you have to design it so that the interests are divided and distilled and represented through a Republican small r form of election of people and then layers of election on top of that to try to get the best people in representational positions. And it all starts with organic, voluntary communities. We have this nonprofit sector that is not voluntary, okay? And you have these tech billionaires leaving to their wives and widows billions of dollars, like Laurene Powell Jobs and Scott Mackenzie Scott, into these crazy left-wing organizations that are all modeled after the George Soros funding model. And they're, you see, they can turn them on a dime, right? After the Floyd murder, boom, next thing you know, they're all in the streets. The minute Biden's elected, somebody like Casey raised a hand, like Casey at the bat, and the crowd shuts up and suddenly everything's fine, right? What happened? And then suddenly the memory hole for all the Antifa rioting and everything, but we have to dilate upon this, disturbance on the Capitol like it was a big darn deal, okay? Yeah, it was sort of a big deal, but it wasn't that big. It was symptomatic of grievances that have not been addressed. And that, in fact, the Democrats continue to double down by saying, Trump, didn't win. Well, I don't know if Trump won or not, but I do know is a lot of questions about this election have never been properly and satisfactorily investigated. And if you change the election rules so quickly, illegally, before the election, and move into these irregular voting patterns without proper scrutiny or investigation, why would you be surprised if most Republicans believe the election was stolen? So there was an old, Emma Wilcox wrote a poem years ago, said, nothing is ever settled until it's settled right. And so the Democrats don't seem to understand that you can't, whether it's amnesty or vote fraud or whatever, which by the way is tied into immigration and document security, you can't settle an issue through just sheer force of will. You have to reach consensus in our country if you want to have happiness moving forward. And they need to be reminded the Hispanic community is not the African American community for many reasons, diversity, temperament, and everything else. They believe they can lock in the Hispanic vote like the African American vote since the 60s. Never going to happen. But until they believe that, until they understand that, they're going to continue to believe they don't have to meet Republicans or Americans at all in the center to reestablish and assert proper regulatory control over these borders. But a country that doesn't have borders is not long for this world.
Dan Stein, words of wisdom. If people would like to support your efforts at FAIR or get some of the information, you have a wealth of information online, tell us how they can do that.
Well, we have a great website, and you can just sign up. Doesn't cost you anything. FAIRUS, FAIRUS.org. And, you join up, you get our alerts and all this information you can use. And, of course, if you decide to give us $1 or $2, we don't complain. But we provide all these free for you to get involved because we're trying to bring our expertise to your activism and your concern as a citizen. Remember, there's asymmetry here. We're up against billions of dollars of opposition. So we have only the American people to turn to.
Dan Stein, thank you so much for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Always great to see you.
Join the revolution. Online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration, nationalism, and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. We welcome Kris Kobach, former Kansas Secretary of State, member of We Build the Wall. There's so much to talk about. He's been a guest with us over the years, and I'm pleased to have you back, Kris Kobach. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
This has got to be a very disheartening time. I know you well enough to know that you have an upbeat attitude. You always have a smile on your face. But to look what's happening to the nation right now, particularly in contrast to the last 4 years, has got to be just devastating.
It is devastating. You know, we had so much progress in stopping and reducing illegal immigration during the Trump years. I had the honor to advise President Trump on so many aspects of his policies. And now we've just seen it intentionally unraveled by President Biden, and not only that, illegally unraveled by President Biden. One thing you may not be aware that I'm doing right now is I'm representing 7 Texas counties and sheriffs who are suing the Biden administration over the border crisis because the Biden administration is breaking federal law. It is disheartening. It's so much progress, and it's amazing how quickly they can tear it down.
You know, Kris, you mentioned going to court, and I know a lot of people who are talking about this, but it almost appears, and I don't mean to be discouraging, that even the courts have become corrupted, that we're not able to expect the rule of law is going to be upheld even by the courts, and that's got to be doubly difficult.
So as an attorney who practices in federal court, I can echo that with one caveat. It depends on where you are. There are still many, many judges who abide by the original understanding of the Constitution, who interpret statutes faithfully and don't try to change the meaning of the statutes. That said, there are some judges who are what we call activists, who are judges who just do not they do not stick to the judicial role of interpreting the law, and instead they take an active role of trying to change the law. But there are many, many good judges out there, and also the Supreme Court is very good. And so, you know, the bottom line is, even though someone who's seeking to vindicate their rights might lose in front of an activist judge at the district level or at the appellate level, hopefully they'll get vindication in the Supreme Court.
So when the Supreme Court tells the President of the United States you can or you can't do this, and he totally defies them, where do we go from there?
Yeah, let's talk about the specifics. So I assume this is the case you're talking about, and that is, well, there's actually a couple of examples, but this is the one regarding the Remain in Mexico policy.
Yes.
So, U.S. District Court judge for the Northern District of Texas about a month ago rules that the Biden administration cannot reverse the Trump's administration's Remain in Mexico policy because that policy is in part compelled by federal law. Federal law says that if you are coming in illegally over the land border and you do not have lawful status, which is the case with virtually all these people coming in, you have 2 choices. You can either detain the person, or you can ask them to remain in Mexico until they have an immigration hearing if they're claiming asylum. Those are the only 2 choices. The judge rules this way. Biden administration says, "Oh no, we don't want to abide by that injunction. We're going to ask the Court of Appeals." The Court of Appeals says, "Nope, we're not going to stay the injunction. The judge was right." Then they go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, "No, we're not going to stay the injunction. The district judge was right. You have to restart the Remain in Mexico policy." So then what happens? A weekend passes, and then the next Monday, the Biden administration, Department of Homeland Security, releases a very short statement that's about 1 paragraph long. And they say, we intend to comply with the judge's order. We will begin to start the process of talking with Mexico about how we will comply with the judge's order, which means they're dragging their feet. It's been over a month now. They've done nothing. And so what do we do about it? At some point, the state of Texas, who's the plaintiff in that case, I believe needs to ask for a contempt order and say, look, these federal officials are defying a judicial order. It's been a month. It's been 2 months, however long it's going to be before action is taken. But this is a country where nobody's above the law. Yet the Biden administration is defying a federal court order that the Supreme Court said must stand. It's extraordinary right now. We've seen situations, and I, as an attorney, have seen situations going back to the Obama administration where the executive branch breaks the law, but eventually a court rules and order is restored. Well, here a court has ruled, and the Biden administration continues to break the law. It's staggering. I mean, this is something we haven't seen, to my knowledge, in the United States anytime since the Civil War, of an administration breaking the law and then ignoring, or at least for the time being, they appear to be ignoring a court order telling them they're breaking the law.
It absolutely is staggering. Kris Kobach, I want to talk about the role a little further, about the role of states in this fight. You mentioned Texas. Texas Governor Abbott has been pushing back, but there's a lot of threats from the federal government, and it seems like we're kind of in uncharted territory. So from a state perspective, if you're suffering like Texas is, how far can you go, or do you just keep going until the problem's solved?
Well, look, the states really are our best champions here. The state attorneys general have the authority to bring suit against the president if the state's budget is impacted, or if the people of the state are hurting in a way that gives them standing. And that's why I applaud Ken Paxton, who's the attorney general for the state of Texas. He has brought the lion's share of lawsuits pushing back against the Biden administration. And so that's one area where the states play an incredible role, is holding their feet to the fire in court, holding the Biden administration's feet to the fire. And so, Texas has been absolutely essential. And one of the reasons I've decided to run for attorney general in Kansas, which is an open seat in 2022, is if you're attorney general, you can actually bring it. You will have standing in almost every case to represent the interests of the people of your state and also defend the people of the United States where you have a lawless administration. And so, I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ken Paxton in Texas and hold the Biden administration accountable because they are breaking the law.
We have an attorney general who's kind of doing the opposite. He's supporting the lawbreakers. In Virginia, we have Mark Herring, who's just been awful. But talk to us about the coalition of attorneys general who get together from a conservative constitutional perspective and the sort of power that comes through that sort of a coalition.
It's very important. So when Texas brings a lawsuit, they can then circulate the briefs to the other red state attorneys general and say, hey, will you sign your name and join us? So it's not just Texas. It's Texas plus 14 other states that will bring a lawsuit, or maybe Texas plus one other state. But the bottom line is there is an alliance of people who are trying to restore the rule of law.
Let's talk about the wall. You have certainly been an advocate of the wall, the border wall. We had good progress, but I've heard conflicting reports about the current status, so maybe you could fill us in.
Yeah, so the Trump administration, well, let's back up. Before the beginning of the Trump administration, there was about 100 miles of our 1,900-plus mile border, 100 miles of true barrier that would stop pedestrians. There were these sort of Normandy barriers, they're called, where you could stop a vehicle, but a person could just hop right over them. They're knee-high, right? The Trump administration comes in, builds 400 miles, give or take, of wall. So now we're up to 500 miles of true barrier that can stop people illegally coming into the United States. But we've still got over 1,400 miles that's wide open. And the Biden administration just ceased construction, ignoring the contracts, ignoring the fact that the materials had already been delivered and that there were steel bollards sitting on the work site ready to be put in. And it was more expensive to remove them, as the Biden administration wanted to do, than to go ahead and just finish the project. And it's absolutely astonishing. They are so opposed to securing the border. They don't want the border secured. And now we're looking at a situation where we've got so much work left to be done. And one of the reasons why you're seeing all of this cartel activity and illegal immigration into Texas is that most of the border barrier was built in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. The reason for that is a little historical trivia, but back in 1906, the Roosevelt Reservation was issued proclaimed by President Roosevelt. Roosevelt Reservation says that the federal government gets a 60-foot right-of-way along the border and can do whatever it wants, and build, in this case, build barriers. Texas was already a state, and so there is no Roosevelt Reservation in Texas. It's private property. So the Trump administration, wanting to build as fast as it could, said, okay, well, we'll build primarily in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And so that's what they did. But meanwhile, Texas is wide open, 800 miles of largely unprotected, wide open border. And that's why you're seeing most of the incursions right now coming in through Texas. And that's why also you're seeing the Texas governor saying, okay, it's time for us to start building a wall.
Let's talk about the legality of that, and is it going to get court challenge from the administration if they try to do that?
I think the administration would have a hard time challenging Texas. It is the flip side of the Roosevelt Reservation is because there is not one in Texas. It is private property. As long as Texas is building with the consent of the landowner or is building on Texas state lands, and and they've got lots of land to choose from to keep building. So Texas should be safe. It would be hard for the Biden administration to stop it.
What about the finances of that? Do they have any opportunity to tag into the original contracts, or are they going to have to pay for it out of their own pockets?
Texas is going to have to pay for it out of its own pocket. And although there are a lot of Americans who are donating to that project as well, just as people have donated to We Build the Wall.
Kris Kobach, as we go forward, let's talk about maybe 3 or 4 things that could or should be done to kind of turn the situation around from the dire circumstances we face.
Well, one, it depends whether we're talking about with the Biden administration in power or in a hopeful day in the future when we have an administration that wants to.
Let's start. If there's anything we can do now, I realize that's a very difficult challenge, but then looking beyond.
Well, what we can do right now is you can support efforts of organizations that are fighting back. So whether that be my organization, which is representing the Texas sheriffs in the lawsuit, that's allianceforfreecitizens.org. That's one thing people can do. You can vote for people. I mean, we've got an election coming up in 2022. Vote for people who are committed and you believe their commitments, because so many Republicans, unfortunately, they'll say one thing and then do another. Who are committed to restoring the rule of law on immigration. Make sure we get people in power in 2022. And that brings up the subject of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. If we can take either one of those chambers back for the Republican Party, that'll put the brakes on some of the stuff the Biden administration is doing. It won't stop their unlawful executive actions, but it'll slow them down. So those are 2 things, right? Support organizations, support candidates, support people who are running for attorney general who will sue the Biden administration, wherever that may be, whether it's in Virginia or in Kansas or whatever state. But there are people who want to do the right thing. So that's one thing people can do right now. If we get to the point where we have someone in the White House who believes in our national sovereignty and enforcing our borders, there's so much, of course, at that point that we can do. We'd have to, again, go back to the lawful policies of the Trump administration, reverse what the Biden administration is doing, and build the dang wall. We absolutely have to finish that job.
Finally, Kris Kobach, so we had actually both houses and the presidency for a brief time.
Yeah.
And we didn't get it done, at least not the way we should have. And so is there hope that the next crop coming in would do any different? Because this seems to be almost a recurring story. Like, hey, if we just got both houses and we have the president, we're going to do all this stuff, and then it just doesn't happen.
I think there is hope. For example, let's suppose that President Trump runs again and wins. I think the second Trump administration would not make some of the minor mistakes that the first Trump administration made that resulted in lost time. For example, the wall building not getting started that first year, but really only getting started late in the third year. President Trump saw what happens when you have people in his immediate circle who weren't working vigorously to move his agenda forward. So I think we can see massive improvements. But again, when it comes to people in Congress, absolutely make sure that they are committed They are against amnesty. They are for the wall. They are for vigorous enforcement of our immigration policies, our immigration laws at the border and in the interior. These elections do have consequences, and unfortunately, we're dealing with the consequences of what happened in the presidential election in 2020.
Kris Kobach, if people want to be in touch with you, if they want to support your efforts, how can they do that?
They can support my efforts to become Kansas Attorney General at kriskobach.com, KRISKOBACH.com. And if they want to support the efforts of our lawsuit in Texas, they can go to the AllianceForFreeCitizens.org, AllianceForFreeCitizens.org.
We're grateful for what you continue to do, Kris Kobach. Thanks for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
My pleasure.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.